The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound that had long ago replaced thought for Silas. It scraped the weathered wood of his cabin, whistled through the cracks he never bothered to mend, and stirred the dust that coated everything he owned. His life was a study in dust and silence. Out here, where the horizon was a flat, unforgiving line, a man could forget the sound of his own voice. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces, the rhythmic thud a lonely heartbeat in the vast, empty dark. His shoulders were permanently weary, carrying a weight no one could see. Inside the cabin, a smoky lamp cast long shadows that danced like ghosts on the rough-hewn walls. A tin cup sat on the table next to a plate, one of each. For years it had been just one. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him, waiting to be built from the splinters of two broken lives. He was a withdrawn man, a silent rider in his own existence, and he believed this quiet hardship was all he deserved. The past was a grave on a nearby hill, a small, unmarked plot he visited only when the moon was thin and his loneliness was a physical ache. His eyes, the color of a slate evening sky, had seen everything and chose to see nothing more. He was emotionally numb, reclusive, a man living a half-life on a homestead in the wilderness, and that was how he intended to die. But fate, like the merciless wind, often blows in directions one does not expect, bringing with it the seeds of change, however unwelcome. A trip to the raw, fledgling town of redemption was a necessity he endured, not a pleasure he sought. The creak of his wagon wheels in the dusty track was the only conversation he needed. He was there for flour, salt, and solitude, but he would find something else entirely. He would find a woman helpless with a child. He saw her standing near the general store, a ghost in the biting wind. She was what they called a mail-order bride, a fragile piece of cargo delivered and then refused. The man who had sent for her, a broad-shouldered rancher named Barton with heavy, solid hands and an even heavier sense of self-importance, was making a public spectacle of his displeasure. The woman stood rigid, her face pale and her expression concealed behind a wall of exhaustion. A small child, no older than 4, clung to her worn-down skirt, her tiny face buried in the folds of the thin fabric. The woman had appeared broken, but Silas, who knew broken things, saw something else. It was not the shattered quality of glass, but the bent and weary strength of old iron. She was silent, but not shattered. Her true identity was written in the dignified line of her jaw and the fiercely protective arm wrapped around her child. She had no riches, but she possessed a quiet strength and a maternal dignity that the wind could not strip away. Barton's voice was a harsh grate in the quiet air, speaking of deceit and undisclosed baggage. The townsfolk watched, some with pity, most with a detached, mocking curiosity. Silas watched, too, and a memory flickered, hot and painful. Another woman, another child, another cold day. His gut twisted. He acted against his nature, against the quiet vow of non-involvement he had lived by for years. He moved without thinking, his boots stirring the dust as he closed the distance. He didn't speak to Barton. He spoke to the woman, his voice rough from disuse. He bought her contract for the price of a good horse, an impulsive act of remorse over a personal loss he could never undo. He became a silent rider who buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. She looked at him, her tired eyes filled with a raw, alert suspicion. He saw fear. He saw exhaustion. But he also saw a flicker of something else, something he had long since forgotten. He saw a soul that, like his, had endured. The journey back to the homestead was a tableau of distrust. The woman, whose name he learned was Alara, sat stiffly on the wagon bench, the child, Lily, asleep in her lap. She had not spoken a word since the transaction. Not a thank you, not a question. Her silence was a fortress, and he was the enemy at the gate. He remained silent, too. What was there to say? He had acted on an impulse he didn't understand, and now the consequence was a tangible, breathing presence beside him. The creak of the wagon wheels was the only sound, a slow, grinding rhythm marking their passage into a shared, uncertain future. When they arrived, the cabin seemed smaller, the silence inside heavier. He gestured for her to enter, his hand feeling clumsy and large. She flinched. The small movement was like a knife in his gut. He stepped back, giving her space, and watched as she took in the sparse room. The cold stove, the single cot, the dusty table with its one tin cup. Her gaze was methodical, searching for threats, for the shape of the trap she now found herself in. She was responding to his help with the only tool she had left: suspicion. He took a blanket from his cot and laid it on the floor in the far corner, as far from his own sleeping space as possible. It was a meager offering, but it was all he had. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of her chin, and gathered her daughter, settling into the corner like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The first night passed without a word. The distant howl of a coyote, the creak of floorboards as he stoked the fire, the soft, unsteady sound of the child's breathing. These were the sounds of their new life. He lay on his cot, staring into the darkness. The numbness that had been his companion for years now pricked with a strange, unwelcome feeling. It was the feeling of responsibility. It was the feeling of another's fear. And it was terrifying. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun. Their lives were a routine of few words. He would rise before dawn, chop wood, tend to his few animals. She would wake later, her movements quiet, unobtrusive. She swept the floor, washed their few dishes, and cared for Lily with a fierce, silent devotion. They moved around each other in the small space, two planets in a silent, lonely orbit, never colliding. He chopped wood deep into the night, the repetitive motion a way to bleed off the tension that filled the cabin. He was splitting his guilt into pieces, trying to make sense of the woman and child who now haunted his solitude. He had offered her a roof, but it was a cold comfort. He had separated her from a public humiliation only to bring her to a private one. No words were exchanged, just the daily rhythm of survival. He began to help in the only way he knew how, secretly, cautiously. He noticed the girl's shoes were thin, the soles worn down to almost nothing. On his next trip to town, he bought a small, sturdy pair of boots, leaving them by the wooden door before dawn, as if they had appeared by magic. When he returned from his work that evening, he saw Lily stomping in the dust near the porch, her small feet snug in the new leather. Alara said nothing, but as she passed him to enter the cabin, her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. He saw not gratitude, but a deep, questioning confusion. It was a start. He started leaving more food on the table than one man could possibly eat, an extra portion of jerky, a handful of dried apples. He would place it there without ceremony and turn away, pretending to be occupied with mending a strap or cleaning his rifle. He never saw her take it, but the next morning it would be gone. Small gestures were all he could manage, attempts to breach the wall of her silence without using the clumsy, inadequate tool of words. He found a small, broken wooden bird by the creek bed, its paint faded and one wing snapped off. He took it back to the cabin and, late one night by the smoky lamplight, he painstakingly carved a new wing from a piece of scrap wood, fitting it into place until the bird was whole again. He left it on the hearth. The next day, he saw Lily holding it, her small fingers tracing the line where the new would met the old. Alara watched her child, and for the first time, Silas saw the rigid set of her shoulders relax, just for a moment. Her suspicion was a hard, frosty ground, but these small, anonymous acts of kindness were like the first rays of a hesitant spring sun. They were not enough to cause a thaw, but they were beginning to awaken a fragile hope. He reinforced a loose board on the porch where she often sat, making it more stable. He started keeping the wood box by the stove filled to the brim, so she wouldn't have to venture into the biting wind. These were quiet, deliberate acts of care, offered without expectation of acknowledgement. He was a man who spoke the language of work, of providing, of fixing what was broken. He did not know how to fix the raw, suppressed fear in her eyes, but he could fix a broken toy. He could provide warm shoes. He could ensure there was wood for the fire. He was intervening in her life, not as a master, but as a guardian, and he did it from the shadows, hoping she would understand that his protection was as quiet and unobtrusive as his presence. The sky turned the color of slate, and the wind, which had been a constant, merciless companion, grew teeth. A blizzard descended upon the plains, a swirling vortex of white that erased the horizon and turned the world into a single, claustrophobic room. The cabin, once a symbol of their separation, now became their shared prison, their only sanctuary against the storm's fury. For days, they were trapped, the howling of the wind a constant roar that made conversation impossible and silence unbearable. The cold seeped through the walls, and they huddled near the stove, the small circle of warmth the entire universe. And then Lily began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry sound, but it soon deepened into a ragged, desperate fight for breath. Fever set in, her small face flushed, her body trembling. Alara froze, her quiet dignity cracking to reveal a raw, animal terror. She held her daughter, rocking her, her own body rigid with fear. All her endurance, all her resilience, was useless against the invisible enemy of illness. In that moment of crisis, the careful distance between them shattered. Silas moved, his actions calm and deliberate. He fetched snow to melt for cool water, his hands, usually calloused and rough from an axe handle, surprisingly gentle as he bathed the child's forehead. He brewed a bitter tea from herbs he kept in a small tin, a remedy his own mother had used. He coaxed the child to drink, his voice a low, steady murmur. Alara watched him, her suspicion finally giving way to a desperate, fragile trust. She saw him not as the man who had bought her, not as her captor, but as an ally in the fight for her daughter's life. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was breaking. He sat with them through the night, keeping the fire roaring, his broad-shouldered presence a solid, reliable shield against the cold and the fear. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He offered action. He offered his steady, unwavering presence. He crouched by the small pallet on the floor, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight, his tired eyes focused entirely on the small, struggling child. He was no longer just a provider of secret gifts. He was a protector, standing watch in the darkest hour. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside. The wind's howl softened to a low moan, and Lily's fever broke. She breathed softly, her small chest rising and falling in a regular rhythm. Alara, exhausted and overtired, finally sagged with relief, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She looked at Silas, her gaze direct and stripped of all pretense. A bond had been forged in the crucible of the storm, a connection born not of words, but of shared vulnerability and a silent, desperate prayer. The ice between them was cracking. When the snows finally melted enough for the trail to be passable, the need for supplies drove them back to the town of Redemption. The journey felt different this time. The silence in the wagon was no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with a quiet, shared memory of the blizzard. Lily, now healthy and bright-eyed, sat between them, occasionally touching Silas's arm with a small, trusting hand. But Redemption had a long memory and a cruel tongue. As they walked towards the general store, a figure stepped out from the saloon, blocking their path. It was Barton, the rancher, his face flushed with whiskey and arrogance. He looked at Alara, his eyes lingering on her with a sneer of ownership. The crowd of townsfolk, ever present, began to gather, sensing a spectacle. "Well, look what the thaw washed in," Barton drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still clinging to this silent fool? I told you she came with damaged goods." He gestured dismissively toward Lily. Alara flinched as if struck. She lowered her gaze, her face paling, and pulled her daughter closer. The child clung tightly, sensing her mother's fear. Alara's hard-won dignity was being stripped from her again, piece by piece, in the dusty main street. She was being laughed at, insulted, reduced once more to a failed transaction. She endured, her body rigid, her silence a shield that was about to shatter. Then Silas moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between Alara and Barton. A solid, unmovable wall. His presence was enough to command attention. He was silent but firm, his gaze level and cold. The crowd quieted, waiting. Barton faltered, unused to being challenged so calmly. Silas looked not at Barton, but at the watching faces of the town. His voice, when it came, was clear and steady, carrying in the sudden hush. "She's with me," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. He paused, letting the statement settle. Then he added the rest, turning his gaze briefly to Alara, a look of profound, protective instinct in his eyes. "Not bought. Chosen." The crowd fell silent. The words hung in the air, transforming the narrative from one of shame to one of honor. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her not as property, but as a partner. Barton, stripped of his power, sputtered a curse and retreated back into the shadows of the saloon. The moment was broken. Alara looked up at Silas's back, at the man who had just stood for her when she could not stand for herself. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Then another. She cried, not from humiliation, but from a profound, overwhelming relief. He stayed, his body a shield, until she had gathered herself. Something had irrevocably changed. They returned to the homestead under a slate evening sky. The air was still, the world hushed after the confrontation. He unhitched the horse, the familiar clinking of metal on tin a comforting sound. She put Lily to bed inside, her movements slow and deliberate. When she came back out, he was sitting on the edge of the porch, staring out at the darkening plains. The wind whispered in the dry grass. She sat near him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. The silence stretched, but it was a new kind of silence, filled with unspoken things that needed to be said. She was the one who broke it. "My husband died of fever on the trail west," she spoke softly, her voice unsteady, as if unearthing words that had been buried for a long time. "He left us with nothing. The agency. It seemed like the only way." She told him of her hope, of her fear, of the crushing disappointment when Barton had taken one look at Lily and cast them aside. Her story was broken, pieced together with trembling breaths, a confession of hardship and quiet endurance. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just sat there, his presence a solid anchor in the twilight, and gave her the dignity of being heard. When she was finished, a profound quiet settled over them again. He nodded, a slow, heavy gesture. He had accepted her past, all of it. Then it was his turn. He didn't look at her, but pointed a weathered hand toward a small, gentle rise on the property, barely visible in the growing dusk. "There's a grave on that hill," he said, his voice raw. "Two of them, my Sarah and our little girl, Anna, taken by the same fever that took your husband." He told her of the life he had lost, of the laughter that had once filled a cabin much like this one, of the silence that had descended afterward. He spoke of the guilt that had driven him into solitude, the feeling that he had somehow failed to protect them. It was a story he had never told another soul. It was a confession of his own concealed pain. As his voice trailed off into the vast, lonely darkness, he felt a tentative, gentle pressure on his arm. Her hand. She had reached across the space between them and was touching his arm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of shared understanding. Her touch was a quiet acknowledgement of his pain, a silent promise. "You are not the only one." He breathed in the frosty air, and for the first time in years, it did not feel empty. They were two solitary souls, each bearing the weight of a silent sorrow. But now they were bearing it together. They were no longer alone. The spring arrived as if summoned by their shared confession. The biting wind gentled into a soft breeze, and the dusty plains sprouted with the tender green of new life. The homestead, which had been a place of shelter and survival, began to transform into a home. They fell into a new rhythm, one of a partnership born of mutual respect. They worked together, their movements synchronized by an unspoken understanding. He would plow the small field he had long neglected, and she would follow behind, planting seeds for a garden. Her presence brought a quiet purpose to his labor. His steadfastness gave her a sense of security she had never known. The silence between them was no longer a barrier but a language. A shared glance across the field, a simple nod as he passed her a bucket of water, a small smile when Lily chased a butterfly. These were their conversations. The heavy, oppressive quiet of the winter had lifted, replaced by a comfortable peace. This was the slow, steady work of building a life. He saw her dignity not as something fragile to be protected, but as an earthy, reliable strength that matched his own. She saw his silence not as a rejection, but as a deep well of suppressed gentleness. Love grows where no one looks, in the soil of shared hardship and quiet, daily acts of care. He began to carve a piece of wood in the evenings. As the days grew longer, it slowly took the shape of a small rocking chair, perfectly sized for a little girl. He worked with a deliberate, focused calm, the shavings falling at his feet, each pass of the knife a testament to his growing affection. This was his way of saying what he could not speak. This was a promise of permanence. This was him building a future. The homestead thrived. The garden sprouted, the calf grew strong, and the sound of Lily's laughter became a regular music in the quiet air. The cabin no longer felt like a lonely outpost but a center of a small, burgeoning world. Winter had passed, and with it the winter of their souls. They had endured the frost and the storm, and now, in the warmth of the sun, they were beginning to blossom. He was watching her one afternoon as she hung laundry on a line, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky, her movements calm and graceful. He realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the weary exhaustion in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. He felt it in himself, too, a thawing, a slow, gentle return to life. A true home had been built, not just of wood and sod, but of forgiveness, trust, and the courage to hope again. In the quiet corners of the world, where life is stripped down to its essential elements, the most profound truths are often found. It is in the vast, empty spaces that the human heart has room to heal. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. This is a story about the quiet dignity of the survivor, about the strength it takes to endure not just the harshness of the land, but the cruelty of others. It is a testament to the fact that a person is not defined by their circumstances, but by their response to them. Alara arrived as a commodity, a piece of someone else's failed plan, but her spirit was never for sale. Silas was a man entombed by his own grief, a ghost on his own land, but his heart was not dead, only dormant. Their connection was not forged in grand declarations or passionate embraces. It was built slowly, deliberately, like a stone wall, one small, honest gesture at a time. It was built with a pair of shoes left by a door, with a vigil kept through a long, feverish night, with 2 words, not bought, chosen, spoken in a dusty street. It is a reminder that true strength is often quiet, and that the deepest love is often expressed not in words, but in the steadfast, reliable presence of another. It speaks to the power of seeing another person's pain and choosing to stand with them in it, not to fix it, but simply to share the burden. Theirs is a love story that grew where no one was looking, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of desolation. It proves that a family is not something you are born into, but something you build, with patience, with kindness, and with the courage to let someone pass the walls you have built around your heart. The greatest journeys are often the internal ones, from numbness to feeling, from fear to trust, from solitude to belonging. He set the finished rocker on the porch. It was smooth and solid, the wood warmed by the afternoon sun. Alara came out of the cabin, a tin cup of water in her hand for him. She ran her hand over the curved back of the chair, her touch gentle. She looked at him, and her eyes held the quiet, steady warmth of the stove on a winter's night. No words were needed. The open window of the cabin let out the scent of baking bread, a smell that had not graced this home in years. Lily, drawn by the new object, came toddling out onto the porch. She approached the rocker cautiously, her eyes wide. She touched it, then looked from Alara to Silas. She saw her mother's soft smile and the man's quiet, watchful gaze. She felt the safety that now enveloped her life, a thick, warm blanket against the world's cold. She climbed into the chair, her small feet barely touching the floorboards. She began to rock, a small, rhythmic creak joining the whisper of the wind. She looked at her mother, her expression serious and full of a child's profound understanding. In a shy, clear whisper that carried in the still air, she asked the question that made their silent world complete. "Can you be my mommy?" It was a question for Alara, an affirmation of a bond already forged. But Silas heard it as if it were meant for him. It was the sound of a root taking hold in new soil. It was the sound of a family being named. Alara crouched, her face level with her daughter's, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I am your mommy." Always Silas stood, his weary shoulders feeling lighter than they had in years. He looked at the two of them, his resilient survivor and her child, and a lifetime of silence broke inside him. He knew what he had to say. He looked at Alara, his gaze holding hers. "Stay here," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, an invitation, promise. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their story is a quiet fire in the vast wilderness, a testament to the enduring power of human connection against the harshest of circumstances. A reminder that redemption can be found in the simple, deliberate act of choosing another person. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that dignity is a treasure that cannot be bought or sold, and that the most powerful words are often those spoken not with the mouth, but with the heart, through acts of quiet courage and unwavering kindness. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the secret gift of shoes, the stand in the dusty street, or the final, quiet whisper on the porch? We'll see you again, where silence means home.